One of the most important tools that authors or writers of narrative have in their toolbox is dialogue. And this is a tool that we expect that you are taking out and you are using consistently throughout your narrative writing. So by the end of the week, you need to be able to write engaging dialogue. You need to be able to punctuate dialogue correctly and paragraph dialogue. So let's start with a scene from The Simpsons. So in this scene, Bart is trying to sneak up on Lisa and spray her with a water gun, but before he can, she turns around and she sticks her finger in the water gun and the water sprays in Bart's face. So what does this scene sound like as dialogue? "I've got you now," Bart snickered as he snuck up behind Lisa. She heard him coming. Yeah, right, she thought. She turned around quickly and stuck her finger in the water gun. Water sprayed all over Bart's face. "You sure got me," she laughed and walked away. So why do authors use dialogue? Authors use dialogue to move the action forward. One of the quickest and easiest ways you can create action or movement in your writing is through using dialogue. Authors use dialogue to reveal something about the characters and/or the relationships between characters, and authors use dialogue to help the reader to imagine the moment. I'm going to ask for you right now to pause the video and to write down these 3 reasons why authors use dialogue in your composition notebook. You're going to write that in your grammar and crafts section, which is the second tab. So let's take a moment to look at an excerpt or an example from a published author, Gary Soto. This is from his short story, The School Play. Mrs. Bunyan, biting on the edge of her pencil, said, "Louder, both of you." Belinda stepped up, nostrils flaring so that the shadows of her nose quivered, and said louder, "Sucka, is there something wrong with your eyeballs?" "Nothing's wrong, I can see." "Louder! Make sure the audience can hear you," Miss Bunyan directed. She tapped her pencil hard against the desk. She scolded, "Robert, I'm not going to tell you again to quit fooling with the beard. It's itchy. We can't do anything about that. Actors need props. You're an actor. Now try again." In this excerpt, Gary Soto uses dialogue to really move the action forward. Let's take a look at this first paragraph, where Miss Bunyan bites on the edge of her pencil and she yells at her students, "Louder, both of you." I want you to imagine that Gary Soto had instead written, "Mrs. Bunyan told them to speak louder." If I read that, I might imagine a woman saying to someone, "Speak louder." But instead, when Gary Soto has Miss Bunyan actually yelling, "Louder, both of you," suddenly I'm sitting in that audience and I'm watching this happen. I'm listening to her yell at her students and I'm watching her poor students on stage react. Gary Soto, throughout this excerpt, uses dialogue to really create action or movement or sound. He also uses dialogue to reveal aspects of the character, and Miss Bunyan is the best example. So I want to try to answer this question together. What can we learn about Miss Bunyan from her dialogue here? So Miss Bunyan, in the first paragraph, she yells, "Louder, both of you." And then later, again, she says, "Louder, make sure the audience can hear you." Miss Bunyan directed. I want you to notice the verbs that Gary Soto uses to describe how Miss Bunyan says things. She scolded. Here's another one. "Robert, I'm not going to tell you again to quit fooling with the beard. It's itchy. We can't do anything about that. Actors need props. You're an actor. Now try again." So what do we learn about Miss Bunyan from her dialogue? I'm going to ask you to pause the video right now and to try to answer this question. Write down 2 or 3 characteristics that you would use to describe Miss Bunyan. So based on your dialogue, I would describe Miss Bunyan as a teacher who scolds her students, a teacher who is fairly strict, and I would argue is pretty bossy. Gary Soto uses dialogue throughout this excerpt to really reveal aspects of the character. He also uses dialogue to really help us picture or imagine this moment as a reader. I can hear Miss Bunyan. I can feel or I can imagine what it's like to sit in that audience and watch her students, her poor students, respond to her yelling or to her scolding. He uses dialogue to really help me to feel like I am present in this moment. So here's where it gets hard. There are a lot of rules about dialogue. You're going to have 3 punctuation rules and 1 paragraphing rule. So let's get started. Rule number 1, if the character says it or thinks it, use quotation marks. Miss Bunyan, biting on the end of her pencil, said, "Louder, both of you." So because Miss Bunyan says it, you need to put it in quotation marks. Also, if the character thinks it, you also need quotation marks. For example, here, when Lisa thinks, "Yeah, right," even though she's thinking it and she's not saying it out loud, you still need quotation marks. Rule number 2, the punctuation goes inside the quotation marks. So if you have a question mark or an exclamation mark or a period, that goes inside the quotation marks. And then rule number 3, if you're going to say he said or she said, you need to put a comma inside the quotation marks. So let's look at an example. Louder, make sure the audience can hear you, Miss Bunyan directed. Because I am putting afterwards how the character says it, Miss Bunyan directed, I'm going to get rid of the period, and I'm going to put a comma here instead. That comma goes inside the quotation marks. Your paragraphing rule is pretty simple. If there's a new speaker, you need a new paragraph. Unlike your argumentative writing or your informational writing, your paragraphs in narrative are going to be really short and sweet. Every time there's a new speaker, you need a new paragraph. For example, here Miss Bunyan yells, Belinda tries to speak louder, Robert tries to speak louder, Miss Bunyan yells again, Robert tries to give her an excuse, but she doesn't accept it. I want you to notice that even Robert's line, "It's itchy," gets a whole paragraph on its own. Because it is a new speaker, because this is not Miss Bunyan saying it's itchy, it's Robert, it's a new paragraph. So I want for you to try these 4 rules. You're going to open your composition notebook to the grammar and craft section, and you're going to write just a very quick flash draft. It should be no more than a few sentences. I guess it's going to be a lot of paragraphs because you have different speakers. So here's your directions. Imagine that you're listening or overhearing a conversation between 2 people. You're going to write that conversation, and your goal is to use all 4 dialogue rules. So at some point, you need to use quotation marks to show that the character is saying something or thinking it. You need to have punctuation, like an exclamation mark or a question mark that goes inside the quotations. And then you need to have you need to say how the character is saying it at some point, like he said or she directed. And if you do that, you need to put the comma inside the quotation marks. And then I should see several paragraphs because you have new speakers. So every time there's a new speaker, you need a new paragraph. I'm going to ask for you to pause the video right now. Make it really short, but try to practice all 4 of these rules. So I want to give you 2 quick tips. These are not rules, these are just ideas. So a lot of teachers will say that said is dead, and that's not actually true. Said is not dead. But here's a quick hint. I want you to try to find a better way than said to describe how the character is saying it. So for example, she scolded, Robert, I'm not going to tell you again to quit fooling with that beard. Using the word scolded or the verb scolded instead of said helps me to read it or hear it the way that Miss Bunyan is actually saying it. She's scolding. Here's your second hint. If the reader knows who's talking, you don't necessarily need to put anything after the quote. So for example, here, Miss Bunyan speaks, and she's scolding Robert for itching his beard, and Robert responds, "It's itchy." Because she says, Robert, I'm not going to tell you again to quit fooling with your beard, I know that it's Robert that's saying it's itchy. So therefore I don't need to say, Robert said. Again here, when Miss Bunyan responds, I know it's Miss Bunyan. I don't need to say Miss Bunyan said or Miss Bunyan responded. Let's look at a bad example really fast for why we do this. Hi, she said. How are you? He asked. I'm good, she answered. That's great, he replied. How are you? She asked. The reason that we follow this hint is because it sounds super choppy when we always say how the character said it. So your job now is to try it. You're going to use these 4 rules and these 2 hints to write either a flash draft or to continue writing your independent writing project. If you're writing the flash draft, we have a separate sheet of paper for you to write your flash draft on. That way we can give you feedback. Here's your directions. You're going to write a flash draft where the dialogue is your primary tool for advancing the action. The flash draft must include the following dialogue. So you can start with this, you can end with this, or you can use this dialogue somewhere in the middle to advance the action. You told me it was safe, I whispered, feeling my pulse begin to quicken. I lied, he said. So you can either start your flash draft with these 2 lines or these 2 speakers. You could end with it, or you could use it somewhere in the middle. But you need to use this to really help you frame your flash draft today. And your main goal is to use dialogue over and over throughout your flash draft to really advance the action. If you are working on your independent writing project, your goal today is to continue writing, and you're going to write a scene where the dialogue is your primary tool for advancing the action. So the scene that you write today really needs to rely heavily on dialogue. Because these are the 3 reasons why authors use dialogue, I am looking today in your writing that your dialogue is moving the action forward, that your dialogue is revealing aspects of the character or the relationships, and that your dialogue is helping me to imagine the moment. Get started writing.